My name is Luis David Fernandez. I am within the framework of the Culture for Peace and Human Rights, the Chair of the Faculty of the Social Science at University of Buenos Aires. We will hold the conference, the Global Purpose on Democracy and Citizens Participation and Interdisciplinary Analysis. In this event, we will have the opportunity to hear the value contribution of the speaker well-versed in these subjects. The conference will be broadcasted on various digital platforms where the audience can link and ask questions that will later be posed to a speaker. Firstly, we had the participation of Professor Pippa Norris, is Paul McGuire Professor of the Comparative Politics and in John F. Kennedy School in the Gagman at Harvard University in the United States. She compares democracy, the public opinion, election, political communication, and gender politics worldwide. Her major honor include the Johan Skytte Prize, formalmente conocido como el Nobel Prize in Political Science, the Karl Deutsch Prize, the Australian Kathleen Fitzpatrick Prize, the Sir Isaias Berlin Lifetime Achievement Award, the Fellowship of the American Academy of Art and Science, Ward Miller Prize, Sakit Savansi Prax, the Murran Edelman Lifetime Achievement Award, Samuel Enderfels, the Lifetime Career Award, and other prize in the planet. She is published over the 15 books and is currently considered by many to be the most important figure in political science in the planet. Additionally, we will have the participation of the renowned academic Martin Ueda Zavaleta, Director of the Planning of Dissemination Sector in Political Science for our share at the University of Buenos Aires on the international stage, whose collaboration for the dissemination of interdisciplinary culture knows no bounds. He has given a lecture alongside Nobel Peace Prize laureates such as Adolfo Pérez Esquivel and other relevant figures of contemporary intellectual thought. Currently, he is working on collaborative books with emeritus professor from prestigious universities such as Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and MIT. I would like to note that Professor Pippa Norris will have 25 to 13 minutes to present her insightful contribution on the subjects. And then subsequently, Professor Martin Ueda Zavaleta will have a similar amount of time to make his contribution or opinions on the subjects. Dear Professor Pippa Norris, thank you very much for granting such a high honor today. And now we have the floor.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you. And thank you, Martin, for joining us. And if I can share the screen, which I can, I'm going to show you some of my most recent work, which is essentially all about how we can think about different issues, and in particular, what we're thinking about when we think about cancel culture. So let's just make sure that that's working.
Okay.
We've got that. Share screen. I don't see PowerPoint, but I will go on desktop. Allow me to do that.
Please, that's right.
PowerPoint. There we go. Let's see if I can slideshow. And can you see the first slide with the title? Louis, can you see the first title slide?
That's right. Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, no problem. Yes.
So this is going back to ideas of a spiral of silence and whether or not self-censorship threatens academic freedom. And it could not be more topical given the issues currently dividing American campuses about the issues of academic freedom and protest and how we can think about these issues in a broader context. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about the normative debates about cancel culture, those who critique it and those who think it serves a function. I'm going to talk about the concept, what does it mean, and a theory, and give you some evidence, particularly derived from a new survey with IPSA ECPR, World of Political Science. And this is a survey of almost 2,000 political scientists in over 100 countries worldwide, including Argentina and in Latin America. The results and the conclusions and implications. So this is the argument I'm going to think through, that self-censorship can limit viewpoint diversity. In other words, different views are not going to be heard in the academy, and there's going to be a predominance of those who are often liberal or on the left. And this can be a problem, just like formal regulations of free expression. In general, I'm going to demonstrate that liberal left values predominate, particularly in Western political science, when we look at how academics see themselves and the values they hold. And in these countries, in America, in Europe, and in many other post-industrial societies, what we find is that those who are socially conservative, the minority of scholars, are likely to self-censor both within and outside the academy. In other words, they're not going to express their views freely and openly. But this is not found in many developing countries where there's more conservative cultures. Self-censorship is also a product of culture, attitudes, your status, and your institutions. And why does this matter? Because we need to think through what we can do to maximize viewpoint diversity in the academy, because otherwise we essentially don't know our own views and we need to strengthen free speech. So let me unpack this. First, what's the debate about? Well, there's many, many books which have come out recently in the United States and in Europe about cancel culture. These are just some of them. Some of them are quite popular. Some of them are more academic. Some of them are critical. Some of them are more in defense. We often think of cancel culture in terms of popular media. And so cases come to mind, whether we're talking, for example, about J.K. Rowling's and the way she's been outspoken on transsexuals, whether we think about Harvey Weinstein, who's in court right now, or many other comedians or entertainment figures. But of course, it's also something which is there in politics. And again, we can think of issues from the Me Too movement, criticizing sexual harassment, mobilizing millions of women, through to those on the right, Ron DeSantis in Florida, his Stop Woke Act, criticizing the idea that there should be the left dominance, but also arguing in favor of cancelling certain books which can't be read about, for example, critical race theory. So there are many different manifestations of cancel culture. And in Harvard, where I am, it's very familiar because right now, if you look at what's dividing the campus and you look at what's dividing American campuses, there are divisions about those who are wanting to speak out on the actions in Gaza and who accuse Israel of genocide. The Israeli students and the Jewish students who feel that this is anti-Semitic, threatening their freedom of expression, and many other divisions which are very evident around the current controversies in the Middle East. So cancel culture is there in popular culture, is there in politics, and is there in academia. And again, in Harvard, we've had a lot of controversies right now, where one past president, Larry Summers, criticized the leadership of Claudine Gay, the president, who subsequently had to resign because of the way that these issues were dealt with. And there are organizations in America which have now sprung up to really try to defend academic freedom. For example, the Heterodox Academy, FIRE, and other agencies like PEN America, currently very much divided about questions of free speech and academic freedom. So what do we mean by the concept? Everybody uses the term cancel culture, but we need to understand what it defines as. So here's an attempt to define it, and it's a second attempt of mine. I published an earlier article which had a slightly different slant, but here I've come round to the view that cancel culture is best understood as a chilly climate, which silences speech, which is deemed by those who are seeking to silence it derogatory, hostile, factually inaccurate, or morally offensive. So it's arguments that, for example, somebody else is being racist or sexist, or somebody else is being anti-Semitic. Those are very common ways in which this is being framed. So it has a moral component, a normative component about how people should speak. And the argument is that if something goes beyond that, we should not tolerate it. We should shut it down. We should silence that speech act. Hate speech is one way of framing this, but cancel culture is the contemporary way of thinking these issues through. And why are we concerned about this normatively? Well, in universities and colleges across all countries, this threatens the variety of viewpoints that we listen to. For example, in the classroom, if we only ever hear one side of any argument. In our research, if a particular fashion takes over. In our scientific publications, in our speech, and it can be within and outside academia. And there are two common forms of cancel culture. One is when there's censorship by others, for example, your neighbors or your friends or your colleagues in a department. And self-censorship is not about regulation, it's about your own unwillingness to speak up. So it's far more subtle than simply somebody telling you to shut up, or that you can't give a class, or that you need to change the contents of your classroom pedagogy. It's about how you yourself don't want to express your authentic views in public for all sorts of reasons. Now, understood in this way, what does this mean for how we can think about how to best explain this phenomenon? So there's 4 different factors that might be important, potentially. I'm not going to explore all of them, but here's a way of thinking it through. On the first hand, we can use the argument which is from Elizabeth Noel Newman, who was a German political communication scholar, very widely respected, who spoke about a spiral of silence. And what she suggested was that there's group dynamics. And if you're part of the larger group, and therefore you're heterodox, in other words, you're just part of the mainstream on whatever that topic is, then you're much more willing to speak up. If you're orthodox, you're much more willing to speak up. If you're heterodox and you challenge that, you're not. So there's essentially the social psychological explanation that we need to think through. Then, of course, there might be broader cultural attitudes towards free speech. For example, in some cultures, you can say some things, in others you can't. And that might be a question of tolerance. There is the academic power structure. Who might speak up? Well, you might expect that inequalities of status would be an important factor. For example, if you don't have tenure, if you're starting off in your academic career as a PhD student in the early career stages, versus if you're a senior academic, you have security, then you might be much more willing to speak out. And similarly, things like gender and age might be related to your willingness to self-censor. And then lastly, your institutions might be important. For example, in your university, what's the regulation of free speech? What does it say about any sort of sanctions if somebody says something which the students object to in a classroom, or if you publish something which people are very critical of? So all of these 4 things might be important factors. And what we need to do is disentangle each of these. And in particular, the spiral of silence is the one I'll focus on today, but use these others as controls. So let's move on and say these generate certain empirically testable propositions, and therefore we need to look at some evidence to try to test some of these arguments. So I'm going to draw on the long tradition of academic surveys. It's happened ever since Paul Lazarsfeld started academic surveys in 1958. And then there have been subsequent ones in the United States, for example, by Ladd and Lipset, studies in the United Kingdom, for example, Halsey and Troe, and other more recent ones. So in a similar spirit, I conducted a survey of political scientists in conjunction with invitations from the European Consortium of Political Research, which covers many different countries in Europe, on Eastern and Western Europe, and the IPSA, the International Political Studies Association, which is the largest global survey, global professional association, and they also contacted national associations inviting political scientists to participate. I got in general about 2,000, just under 2,000 responses from academics in over 100 countries. So it really is one of the largest global surveys, and we can find some interesting differences between countries, between regions, and it can help us to explore the questions at hand. All the data is available. If you want to look at it yourself, if you want to do any research on the topic, it's all available at Dataverse. And this is the coverage. As you can see, the darker colors are where we had a higher number of respondents. And it's pretty good, except in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's always difficult to find political scientists. But it's very good in the United States, it's good in the United Kingdom, it's good in Germany, pretty good in Europe. And as you can see, we have colleagues who participated from Russia, from Australia, from Brazil, and from Argentina. So how do we measure self-censorship? Well, obviously, this is complicated to do because if people self-censor, they may be unwilling to tell you in a survey. So what we ask them is, how often have you felt hesitant to express controversial and heterodox views? We wanted to ask them in their own classroom, in their teaching, but also in their research and in their department. But also, I think this is really important in public, for example, on social media platforms or in other public venues. So we want to test not just are people self-censoring in academia, but also maybe they're unwilling to express views elsewhere, in their neighborhood, in their community, or in other media areas. In addition, as well as measuring self-censorship, we wanted to measure whether somebody felt that they were part of the majority of people or whether they thought they were a minority in your personal, political, and moral views. And we asked people about this in their department, in their local community, and in their society. So we'll have to see how people felt themselves to be heterodox versus orthodox. And then lastly, we wanted to measure their values. So we wanted to find out, firstly, how left or right are they? And we asked a question which has been used by other surveys. This is from a survey called CHES. People differ in their views towards economic issues, those on the left, those on the right. Where do you place yourself on this 11-point scale? And we also asked them about their social values between liberals and conservatives, for example, on abortion rights, same-sex marriage, democratic participation versus order, stability, and tradition. And again, 11-point scale from liberal to conservative. So what do we find? Well, let me give you some ways to think through the results. Is it the case that conservatives were more likely to self-censor than liberals? And what else will predict who's going to not really speak up in academic life? Firstly, I've divided the countries into Western societies divided by per capita income. So it's essentially the post-industrial societies, including some of the most affluent countries in the world, versus the non-Western. And I did a simple binary division in order to maximize the number of responses and make it a reliable comparison in both types of countries. And this is the distribution on social values, how far people saw themselves as liberal or conservatives. And on the right-hand side, as you can see, it's a scale. And those academics, those political scientists in the West were strongly liberal on all of these values, on abortion, same-sex marriage, democratic participation, and so on. And the number of people who were on the conservative side was minimal. If you look in non-Western societies, however, these have a lower per capita income, and they often have more traditional social values because they're often more religious. These, for example, are colleagues who are in India, or colleagues who are in Ghana or Nigeria, and colleagues from a number of other societies worldwide. What we can see is that it is a distribution which is a smaller proportion who are liberal, and the distribution kind of mirrors that in the West, but in general, it's much flatter. So we can say basically that if there's an issue about a liberal skew in academia, it seems more evident in affluent countries than it does in many of the developing countries around the world in political science who responded to our questionnaire. And if we look at economic values as a test, what you can see is there's a similar pattern. It's not identical. So again, this is the scale, left to right. In the Western universities, you can see there's a skew towards the left. And in non-Western, it's more of a normal distribution. So again, if there's a skew, it seems to be in Western post-industrial societies where there's the strongest ideological skew in the distribution of how far academics see themselves. Now, how does that actually predict self-censorship? That, after all, is the question we're asking. Is it the case that conservatives are far more likely to self-censor, to not speak up, to not express their own views on controversial issues in their teaching and research, in their department and in social media? And the right hand shows you absolutely. There's a big difference. The self-censorship index has been turned into a 100-point scale on the vertical index. And we can see that conservatives are far more likely to say that they self-censor. They score 80 out of 100. Moderates are more willing to speak up, and liberals have the least self-censorship. They're scoring 20 points less. However, as you can see from the non-Western societies, there isn't much of a skew. It's flat. There's a little bit of a moderate bump, but it's really not that significant. So again, it seems that Western universities have become far more liberal and far more leftist than many other parts of the world. And this does seem to have been related to self-censorship. But let's break this down further. And in particular, what we can do is we can look at the different types or venues for self-censorship. For example, is it in the classroom, or is it also in social media? And the graph on the right shows you hesitancy to express controversial views, self-censorship across all of these different venues. And what you can see immediately is that conservatives are reluctant to speak up in academic environments like the classroom, but they're also unwilling to speak up, or less willing to speak up, in social media and particularly other public venues. So it seems that if there is a skew, it's a social skew as much as an academic skew. This is the full explanation. And I know that you really won't like this, but I'll just briefly go through this, and then we can think about the conclusions and the implications. What I'm doing here is explaining how far people are self-censoring in their own views as they see it in their teaching, research, and social media, and so on. And then I'm putting in a bunch of predictors in a regression model. And first, what you can look at are the figures which are in bold, which are the significant coefficients, and you can disregard the figures which are in grey. So what predicts in Western societies whether political scientists are willing to self-censor? Firstly, a strong effect from whether or not they're liberals or conservatives in their social values, and interestingly, not significant whether they're left or right in their economic values. So it's those moral issues which seem to cause this sense that you can't speak up. If, for example, you disapprove of moves towards gender equality or forms of non-traditional sexuality, which involve gender fluidity rather than marriage and the family, you're much less willing to speak up and you censor your views. If we look at other factors that might predict, if you feel also that in your department you're a minority, you are also less likely to speak up. Attitudes matter. In particular, there's a view amongst those who self-censor that perceptions of a cancel culture has worsened, and they're less in favour of robust free speech. Lastly, what about other factors like academic status and your society? So academic status, some of the factors you might have predicted don't actually matter. For example, it doesn't matter whether you have tenure or not for whether or not you self-censor. It does matter whether you're a woman or a man, and that's to do with, I think, long-standing differences in gender and communications and gender and political expression. It matters in terms of age, and as you can see, it's negative, meaning that the young are more likely and more hesitant to speak up than the old. And lastly, I also put in a societal context. I put in an academic freedom index from the Varieties of Democracy project to see whether or not your society made a big difference. And that has a strong impact, and it's negative. In other words, if there are regulations in your society, which means that there are real controls, there's censorship, or there's essentially, it's very difficult to get a job if you're in a minority in terms of your political views, then you can see that that's a negative factor as well. So your social values, your department, your sense of your attitudes, and some of your social characteristics all help to predict whether or not you self-censor. In non-Western societies, many of these factors don't matter for the obvious reason that there isn't a strong skew on ideological values, as we observed in our graphs. Doesn't matter anything about your department and so on. There's a few other factors which do work in the same way, particularly your attitudes towards free speech. And here it does appear that there are some characteristics which are important, which aren't important in Western universities. For example, your academic status and whether or not you have tenure. So there are factors going on which do differ, but nevertheless, there's a broad pattern which is emerging. So let's say the conclusions. What does this all mean? And then I'll turn over. Morally, self-censorship can be a problem. I think John Stuart Mill was one of the best advocates of liberalism, and he argued basically you don't know your own opinion if you don't know the other side. You don't know your own argument, you don't know your own evidence, unless you can hear criticisms from those who disagree with you. And self-censorship is a major problem for limiting our ability to hear the other side. In Western political science, liberal left values do predominate, and it is the conservative groups who are a minority who are most likely to self-censor. But that isn't the pattern in non-Western societies. And again, this is partly, I believe, because many non-Western countries also have a very traditional set of values. And so conservatives feel more at home, for example, on issues of religiosity or on some issues towards marriage and the family. There are some other factors which do help to predict what's going on as well. And we need to think, I think, more broadly about how we can really strengthen viewpoint diversity and allow more of the heterodox views to be heard. How can we expand freedom of speech? And how can self-censorship be reduced, particularly where you live in a polarized climate, as we do in the United States right now? For example, should university leaders, presidents, strive for neutrality, or should they express moral stances and be engaged with the world? So that's the evidence. All of this is about the core concept of academic freedom. And if we lose that, then I think we're going to have substantial problems. As UNESCO says, academic freedom is the right without constriction by doctrine to freedom of teaching and discussion, freedom of research and dissemination, freedom to express our opinion, freedom from institutional censorship, and freedom to participate in academic bodies. And what's going on right now, I think, in the United States is big debates about how far freedom is being limited, whether people are criticizing the right, for example, in banning books in Florida, or whether they're criticizing the liberal progressive left, for example, for expressing anti-Semitic views. And without that, I think academic work is impoverished, and indeed our educational mission is undermined. All of this data is available if you want to use it. It's called the ECPR Ipso World of Political Science Survey. I did it in 2019, where I published an article about cancel culture, and I've just had a new article accepted in the European Journal of Political Research based on the 2023 survey, which is an update of all of this work. So I very much welcome your views. I hope that that's been of interest. I hope that stimulates discussion, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives on all of these issues.
Thank you very much. This is very perfect for me. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the esteemed college, Pippa Norris, for his invaluable contributions. For her invaluable contribution to these beautiful exhibitions, we offer an interdisciplinary look at the global challenge of democracy and citizen participation. Her brilliant insight had greatly enriched our understanding of these issues. Now is an honor to pass the floor to Martin Ueda, who will further complement this important discussion with his own reflections. Welcome, Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you, Luis. Estimate Professor Pippa Norris, it is an honor for me to be sharing a panel with a professional of great trajectory and relevance within the field of political science studies on a global level. I highly value your academic work related to democracy studies, political values in different countries, your contribution to comparative politics, among others. I also commend your activism and constant engagement between the university and other civil society environments to promote good democratic practice. Now, looking at the global panorama, there is a certain degree of pessimism and distrust regarding the direction several countries in the Western sphere are taking. It is important to mention that since the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been no opposing alternative to democracy. Within the discursive and operational framework of democracy itself, that is to say, even if a government espouses elements that may be opposed to the liberal values of democracy, they always strive to stay within a framework of free and democratic election. Similarly, and regression or deviation from this tradition is not well tolerated. However, there is a difficulty regarding the proper functioning of democracy, as authoritarian proposals have been gaining strength in countries that have made considerable advance within democracy. Nevertheless, we can observe a high degree of resilience from societies whose democratic institutions are failing road. Likewise, several countries with an emphasis on Latin America celebrate their post-dictatorship and democratic renewal period, with some exception. Sorry, some exception. Okay. By observing some relevant example, it has been noted that there are central traits once considered irrelevant in the political landscape, which may indicate a certain imbalance in what we can full democracy. Even so, other countries don't follow the same tradition, or it could be said that the regression has been disruptive. Rather, the very natural of democratic imposition in these countries may create a strong differentiation from more developed democratic nations. Although there are autocratic temptation and it may be harmful, the fact the fact that many of these countries have been in certain comfort zone regarding their political parties, which adhere to values inherent to a liberal, democratic or progressive tradition, doesn't mean a radical staple for their democracy. To a large extent, the pessimism may be based on comparison over the years, but this can be arbitrary if one compares democratic decline of countries. There may be an unfavorable trend in certain years, but if compared to democratic period, if compared to the period before World War II, there isn't significant deterioration in comparison. This isn't to say that is incorrect, but caution must be maintained regarding period comparison, observing the indices of the economy's Freedom House or the variety of democracy project. There is a lot of heterogeneity among countries. There is uniformity. But solid democracies traditionally, it would perfect be exaggerated to say that democracy decline is solid. What can be mentioned is that they may enter a certain scenario of decline, but this isn't necessarily related to an assertion of democracy decline. It is necessary to draw a differentiation. For example, there are parties, political figures that apparently have a disruptive origin of their own, and there are others that have been radicalized. The former are those parties or organizations that have had a radical tendency since their origin. The latter can be considered the follow an electoral trend. In both cases, it can be considered that citizen participation can shape one over the other. It is important the emphasis that this doesn't occur in all cases. This may change or different according to the political culture traditional that originates in each country. The legacy of René Langenhardt and Professor Pippa Norris regarding the world values survey provides data that can better explain the social and political context of other spheres of the planet. But I will explain that later. The confusion lies in those Western citizens from post-industrial societies where post-material values are of great relevance are representing that While it can be considered to a large extent that economic inequalities, as well as the crisis in the Eurozone in 2007 and 2008 can influence. But I can also take into account other elements more of a political nature that may exacerbate part of the population, especially those sympathetic to the strong right, which may be a certain weirdness towards a great relevance of identity issues that generates rejection in these sectors. This as well paying out may have given tools to populist figures like Trump, who is well known as a form of political strategy that is able to communicate with his electoral group. Similarly, the discourse priorities as against the others, sometimes very characteristic of socialist discourse, but in this case, the others are necessarily the rich, but the so-called establishment. In addition, though these social networks have created a series of dichotomies and complex conspiracy theories where an elitist is accused of plotting and ruling the country behind the scenes. This kind of paranoia is a determinant, but there must be a self-assessment by the representative of liberal democracy in how we have been able to get here. There was great confidence in the proliferation of liberal values, likewise neglect with other segment of the population. This segment of the population advocating for conventionally and traditionalists must be prevented from feeling indifferent. Their problems must be addressed, and I tend to open a dialogue with those this being minimized or judged. The greatest challenge we face is the have then within the public sphere. One key element, although it cannot be tangible evidence and still needs to be addressed in a more systemic way, is the so-called perception of the cultural war that is taking place. This is sometimes exclusive to advanced democracy countries. Many countries, so-called peripheral ones, prison groups that are immersed in the cultural war, a mixture of different internal enemies has been created, in which groups advocating for liberal values are stigmatized as communist. Similarly, new leaderships influenced by politicians from Central America, the regional where I live, it is evident in the World Values Survey that many Latin American countries are within a spectrum that is more tolerant of authoritarian and dictatorial governments. Despite the fact that most countries have had processes in which democracy has been consolidated, people, due to various circumstances and structural problems, consider it necessary to grant part of their freedom in exchange for their security. Many parties with authoritarian tendencies, some even claiming some policies from periods of dictatorship governments, have maintained a certain sympathy for the authoritarian proposals of those previous governments, except for some countries like Argentina, where the democratization process came accompanied by a total political elimination of the vestiges and actors of the dictatorship, or Brazil until before the arrival of Bolsonaro, but then the experience of Chile, Peru, Colombia, political parties with authoritarian tendencies have always been present within both political spectrum. However, parties that maintain a certain degree of discrepancy have polarized radically, or new actors have emerged that, in the face of any threat to their values, appeal the theory of internal enemy against their opposition, even polarizing with moderate sectors that don't adhere to their political values cause. The main change lies in the initially traditional conservative parties try to present themselves as certain of the principles, the work of the status quo. They weren't considered anti-system, milk less as great transformers, but now, based on the influence with these new alternative rights, they have ring with the samples and manage a discourse where they have placed progressive as synonymous with the status quo, and being ultra-conservative is revolutionary. The proposed construction of the new man, where traditional greatness that has been lost is revealed, even if the ideal country's model they claim was lost never existed, and there is a constant fatalist about the part the country is talking. Therefore, they claim to be the only force capable of. Okay, sorry, miss. Sorry, teacher. Yes. Okay. Bueno. Sí, sorry. The main integration is the ration of democratic roles. It can be observed of denial of electoral default. Both Trump and Bolsonaro have done everything possible to now recognize their defeat their follower, even when so far is to try to over the institution. The sun happens other moments. In Peru, a very particular case stood the Fujimori Park, which took the most retrograde anti-liberal elements, was able to cooperate with moderate liberal sector. It even maintained the indifference of some progressive factor. It denied and tried to construct the electoral victory of Pedro Castillo in Argentina. Milei supporters considered if their candidate lost, there was a conspiracy behind an electoral fraud. Similar, another transgression is that many of these new political actors, when assuming position of power, present hostility towards the press, not only alternative media, but also official media. Peru this year is parliament permit allow seeking the journalist providence the way counting the existence allows seeking the permanent and journalist providence. The way counting the violence in several countries against journalists, either due to the problems of structural violence or in Mexico, with the cartels South America regarding environment destruction or by institutional hostility.